Welcome to Africa's Big Switch. My name is Daniel, and my co-host is...
Dami Adeyemi. I'm here with Daniel today.
Today we're going to be speaking to Ronan Ferguson, a senior manager at the Clean Cooking Alliance, about tackling the clean cooking problem in sub-Saharan Africa, but also sort of just the wider developing context. So I guess we'll just start with an introduction. Ronan, would you like to tell us a bit about your background and how you got into the world of clean cooking?
Yeah, no, thanks, Daniel. Thanks for making the time. So my name's Ronan, and 8 years ago, my job was to lobby for tax breaks for oil companies. And we were pretty good at it. We got a lot of oil fields approved that otherwise wouldn't have happened through some fiscal lobbying that we did back when I was in a trade association in the UK for the oil and gas industry. That, for one reason or another, took me into Accenture, management consulting firm, where I worked with oil companies again and moved through towards the utilities side of the house. Then I had a bit of a pivot and went to work in a part of Accenture called Accenture Development Partnerships, which takes Accenture's talented people and technologies and applies them to social impact. And it was then in October 2017 that I found out about clean cooking. Before that moment, I'll hold my hands up and say I thought clean cooking was something to do with kind of preparation of food, so food hygiene. But actually, it's all about the fuels that people use to cook with and the appliances that they use to make meals. And from that project, I was hooked. A really, really interesting topic to grapple with. And from there, I'm really happy to say that I've moved into CCA, the Clean Cooking Alliance, from October of last year. So just less than 6 months. But I'm working in the market strengthening team, which is all about working with a selection of companies that we think have got really high potential and helping them to reach scale.
Yeah, so that's really interesting and a really interesting journey as well, I feel. Quite different areas that you've been involved in. So I guess maybe for our listeners who this whole idea of clean cooking might be also fairly novel to them, maybe like you, they might think, or like you previously, they might think this is, related to food hygiene and such practices. I think, would you like to maybe just give us kind of a benchmark or like a scaling of what the clean cooking problem is globally and why it's a pressing issue that people should be concerned about?
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so it's an issue that people should be concerned about, and certainly an issue that people could be more aware of, I think, especially given the size of the problem at hand. So 3 billion people across the planet cook with biomass. So that could be charcoal, it could be wood fuel, it could be animal dung. And when you consider using different types of fuel, that number could actually rise to 4 billion using some kind of fuel that isn't clean and can have detrimental impact on health. And the detrimental impact on health is quite staggering. It's globally 4.4 million deaths a year are attributable to people that cook with unclean fuels. Now, to put that into perspective, because that's a huge number, that's more than tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV/AIDS combined, right? So a tremendous and tragic loss of life associated with how people cook. So that's the kind of the health size of the challenge and the kind of the market size of it. Yeah, it's also a really important issue in terms of the climate. So apparently up to 58% of black carbon emissions comes from burning solid fuels that are cooked in the homes. And black carbon is right up there with methane and CO2 as a climate forcer. So a really, really important thing to not be putting into the atmosphere. And then the other important part of clean cooking, which doesn't get much press around it at all, is the impact on women and gender. Surveys have kind of indicated that up to 10 hours a week are spent by women and children out actually going and gathering firewood, collecting the fuels to cook with. So just a huge social opportunity cost as well associated with clean cooking.
Okay, I have a quick question. Actually, like you said, it's a massive problem. But why do you think it's so acute within Africa generally compared to other countries who also go through the same issues?
Wow, Demi, that's such an excellent question. So I'd start by comparing to countries like the UK and the USA. Why do we not have a problem with clean cooking by and large? And I'd say that the answer to that is that utility companies have stepped in, provide, so you and I here in the UK cook with either electricity or gas, basically. And that takes, decades of planning. Daniel, you're probably the best person to talk about utility business models and how that, can achieve scale across countries. But why has that not happened in Africa? I think that policy has got a huge part to play. In terms of making an environment that is open to having businesses come and supply solutions that customers want to pay for. Yeah, so it's probably a policy issue, I'd say.
Yeah, and I guess, definitely, because I guess maybe compared to the UK, for example, most countries in Africa wouldn't have, like the gas grid, this level of infrastructure there is in the UK to be able to transport gas to everyone's homes. Or, we also have energy access issues, which means that even for electric cooking, people don't have access to electricity in the first place. Well, that's not really going to be an option. So I think we'll come into actually some of those solutions that are being deployed in sort of rural communities in Africa and other places where clean cooking is a very pertinent issue. But just touching on something you mentioned earlier, I think why, and this might be, speculative, but why do you think there is less press around clean cooking? Just because I think you said it's like 4 billion people in the world who at some point at least use dirty fuels to cook, and that's considerably higher than the number of people who, for example, don't have access to electricity. So I was wondering, why do you think there's less press around it?
I think this goes right down to the level of the kitchen, actually, and by and large it's women that do the cooking in households across sub-Saharan Africa. Why is clean cooking, so this is answering a slightly different question, why is clean cooking kind of overlooked at a national level? First of all, there isn't that connection between what governments know will have people come out and vote for them and clean cooking. And there's a connection there by the women doing the cooking and not having their voices around what they need in terms of clean cooking solutions available to them to make that an issue that politicians are willing to make change about. So there's a lost voice kind of connected in between there. If that voice is missing, that connection is missing between the kitchen and the government, becomes, I think, a bit difficult for press to come in and amplify the messages. Actually, there have been some pretty amazing press coverage given to some clean cooking companies, like the New York Times gave coverage to a company called Inyeri a couple of years ago and really kind of showed what the clean cooking issue is about. So it's possible. It's difficult for companies to come in and simultaneously, in some cases, raise the supply of what it is they're supplying, generate the demand amongst the potential consumers, and then also do a wider advocacy piece around that as well. A lot of companies in the clean cooking space have become what we call vertically integrated. So they're trying getting involved in pretty much every step along the value chain. So to throw in media messaging around it is perhaps a difficulty too far. So again, if they're not raising their voices and the women in the kitchens by and large aren't able to raise their voices, like who's going to hear them? It's quite difficult to get it into media to make other people like you or I sat here in London aware of it.
I think I have a follow-up question actually. So even if, let's say, clean cooking had all the media and all the attention, and even as far as policy being implemented to support that, do you think that people would be receptive towards it? Because I've seen, like, some of the things I've read kind of indicated that the reception has been a bit mixed, and a lot of people just didn't really care to go out and get the appliances and go out and actually, implement those new technologies within their day-to-day lives. So do you think that even if people were aware of the gravity of the situation and had access to, I guess that's another point, but had access to the technologies, do you think they would be receptive towards it?
I think the key thing you said there, Demi, is about implementing it into their everyday lives. I think that's a really good point. It's extremely difficult, and sometimes it's handy to show a contrasting situation. If I invited you to go to South Texas and say to the barbecue pulled pork eateries down there, forget cooking with charcoal. You need to cook on wood pellets because it's actually way better for people's health, like who are doing the cooking. And let's just assume that you can do the whole supply side. We're talking purely demand at this point. It's actually, just put yourself in that person's shoes doing the cooking. Like, I know how to cook with this method. I like the taste. This is how it's done. In the case of like street sellers selling food, I know that people like this type of taste of food. So why would I risk that? So much kind of cultural nuance around cooking And that's a big contrast between cooking and say off-grid lighting, right, where it's very binary. You have light, you don't. Cooking is literally a matter of taste. So it's so tricky just to come up and expect people to change. Things like cost are important, in terms of influencing demand. It's not that simple. It's not binary.
So, yeah. And I think maybe just on what you were saying earlier, I wonder if maybe there'll be more appetite for the clean cooking discussion now that, the men also have to be at home while the cooking's being done with lockdown across the continent. Maybe they're going to be more aware of this issue with the fumes. But yeah, I think we've already touched on some of those factors that affect uptake of clean cooking. So things like we mentioned cost, we mentioned people's just what we'd maybe call orthodoxies, like the ways they're used to doing things. And we've also mentioned policy. I was just wondering, do you think there are any other quite important factors that are limiting the uptake of clean cooking just globally and particularly in Africa?
I think picking up on that last conversational thread, Daniel, that's an important point actually around. So whilst I've made a gross generalization that women tend to do the cooking in sub-Saharan Africa, I'm going to make another sweeping generalization and say that men tend to be the budget holders in the households. And therefore you've got quite a difficult dynamic where the person making the purchasing decisions for the households, their needs and what they think good looks like just isn't aligned with who's actually wanting to buy the improved cooking solution. So that's a huge demand issue. And I think that a company called Clasp released a report recently which showed for electric cooking appliances, men out of a category of 15 electrical weak grid items like fans, televisions, refrigerators, electric cook stoves, men put that at 15th out of 15 in terms of the important, in terms of impact. And when the same survey was done for women with the same categories, it wasn't bottom, it was 8th. So it was some kind of mid-table. It wasn't top either. But that just kind of shows the interesting difference there around gender dynamics in the household. And I think you're right, the lockdown, maybe that will have some impact. There are also some pretty interesting innovations going on in terms of appliances. So some cook stoves make use of this thermionic effect, which means that you can charge mobile phones from a lit stove. So yeah, that kind of thing might bring the kind of purchasing decisions together, because then it's something that impacts everyone in the household in a positive way.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I guess maybe you started going along the path of some of the solutions, and I thought it'd be good to hear about what you think are solutions that are actually making a difference, or like that are showing the art of the possible. So this can be taken both from a technology lens in terms of like clean cooking innovation and the ones that are actually, being successful in the market. And then also from a policy lens, if there's any sort of visionary, I guess, policies that have been implemented, particularly in Africa, but also other contexts around clean cooking.
So I think that the magic happens in improving clean cooking when you start to think about how best to mix the fuel and the tool, the actual cook stove that people are cooking with. And the best of the best, top of the ladder, is green electrons powering electrical grids to which electrical appliances are plugged into for cooking. Like that's the cleanest, that's the healthiest way of doing it. Nepal is doing some pretty impressive things from a policy perspective around linking the supply of hydroelectric power to demand for electric cooking through induction cooking in terms of demand. So on the supply side, they're adding something like 5 megawatts of supply through hydroelectric dams every 5 years for the next 15 years. So it's kind of 15 megawatts of supply coming on there. And what they're doing is they're putting in place a geospatial data platform partnership with CCA and WRI to be able to link up, okay, this is where the supply is across the country. This is where the demand is that is currently not connected to that supply. How can we incentivize the bridging and the matching of supply and demand there? So I think that is a really exciting example of data-driven positive policy that's coming out. So kudos to Nepal for that. In terms of some of the companies and what they're doing, and maybe just to lift the lid on clean cooking. There's clean cooking as a sector, it's almost a misnomer. There's so many different subsectors that are part of clean cooking. LPG, completely different to biogas. Biogas, very popular with kind of rural communities where you've got farming animals, and you've got the bioslurry that then feeds into the biodigester, creates the biogas. Obviously, that kind of solution just doesn't work in Dar es Salaam, right, where LPG kind of tends to dominate. But you've got other interesting kind of fuels that are cleaner, like ethanol as well. And a really interesting company there in Nairobi, Cocoa Networks, which is solving for kind of last mile distribution of ethanol. So actually being able to, what they have is this kind of fuel ATM, they call it, which is installed in corner shops, spaza shops in downtown Nairobi. And people come in, they take in their canister, they plug it in, and they pay for what they call a sachet amount. So 20 shillings worth of fuel, which they get out, which is topped up into the canister, and then they go back and cook with that. And what that does is it takes down some of the cost barrier, right, which LPG, for instance, typically has. It's quite expensive to come and buy a 15 kilogram canister of LPG just off the bat there. So they found a way to make the incrementalizing the amount that you can actually buy of the fuel.
No, that's really interesting. And I think there's kind of an informal term that's used, probably, I don't know if it's used elsewhere, it's used in Nigeria, called like sachetization or sachetization, where it's like, if people don't have that upfront capital to invest in big things, we can always sort of modularize it into smaller and smaller increments so people can sort of just pay as they go. So that's really interesting. I hadn't heard about that. I guess you've kind of touched on, you mentioned CCA and the work they're doing with the Nepalese government, I assume. And it'd be nice to hear a bit more about, the Clean Cooking Alliance. You said you've been with them since October last year?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, so it would be nice to hear a bit more about the work they do, some of the companies that they're supporting, and what it looks like, solving clean cooking issues on a daily basis.
So in the Clean Cooking Alliance, we've got the part of the team that I'm in, we've got this program called the Cooking Industry Catalyst, which has 3 prongs to it. And the first prong is looking at the most interesting and innovative companies in our venture catalyst portfolio, about 30 companies like Cocoa Networks and others that I've mentioned already, and looking really at what do they need that can help them get to the next level. Is it expanding into a new market? Is it increasing the product range? So we work with them on kind of technical assistance or small grants to help them move strategically in the directions that they see as being important to them. We've also got a second prong to that trident, is the market catalyst. And this is the kind of initiatives where a rising tide can lift all the ships in an ideal world. So things in this space might be, how can we encourage more investment to come into the clean cooking sector? Last time we looked, kind of 2019 data, that's the most recent that we've got, there was $90 million that came into the clean cooking sector across 30 companies that we track. And sounds like a lot, but really in the grand scheme of things, it isn't. And it isn't enough to really touch the sides on solving something that affects 3 to 4 billion people around the world. Market Catalyst is looking, I think, a lot at how can we encourage more investors to come into the clean cooking space? And one of the ideas that we're looking at, well, first of all, one of the barriers that we see is access to information is really difficult. So how can we help reduce the barriers blocking investors coming in to find information that would help them decide, okay, yeah, this is something that I want to invest in? One of those initiatives that we're looking at, for instance, is sector-wide key performance indicators. So what currently happens at the moment is investors, if they do get to this point, which is already quite rare to be interested around clean cooking, go and speak to company A, find out how they're performing, go and speak to company B, find out how they're performing, and then make a decision on, okay, we're going to go due diligence or make it simultaneously. Other investors going to the same companies, asking the same questions. Companies, as I've already kind of alluded to, being stretched quite thin across a lot of activities and having to raise capital quite an intensive process in itself. So they're kind of, at the moment, fielding a lot of requests from a lot of different parties and not necessarily getting returns for that time invested. So the thinking is, if we can get a reliable set KPIs together and the data to those KPIs, maybe that would help tell the story of the evolution and the investability of some of these clean cooking companies that are operating. I think kind of behind that, what's a really interesting innovation that's happening in clean cooking at the moment is around pay-as-you-go. And I think, Daniel, it was you that mentioned it earlier. This is an exciting space for clean cooking. The idea that you can start to see customers come back and pay as you go to cook creates a lot of data, creates a lot of insight that can inform some good action from the cooking company side of things, which can then tell a good story to investors around their portfolio of customers. And if you extend loans to them, this proportion can be expected to repay on time, right? And just having visibility into that is really interesting, potentially game-changing for clean cooking.
Yeah, I have a question. So we kind of mentioned briefly like the effect that COVID has had on clean cooking generally, but how would you say it has affected the work that you're doing, like the output? Because I've seen, some places saying, like some of the research is saying that it's exacerbated, particularly the health risk, because of course like COVID is a respiratory issue, and of course like being, again, like the issues of clean cooking, the health implications are also respiratory issues like pneumonia and stuff like that, as mentioned, but also from a more like base level, because although like the progress being made has been incremental generally in the cooking sector, the impact of COVID has also then now even slowed down more like the progress within the sector. So how would you say the work being done has been impacted?
People need to cook regardless of COVID. So from a demand for clean cooking point of view, that doesn't go away. It's certainly true that from a health perspective, cooking with dirty fuels, as you say, exacerbates the problem and the difficulties of respiratory illness. Some companies have still been able to reach their customers, and actually those solutions that are able to provide their cooking solutions in a way that is very convenient to customers have actually seen an increase in sales, right? Because people are trying to socially distance, they don't want to go out to the market. So actually those that can deliver cooking fuels to homes are at an advantage compared to those that are not. But those that use kind of sales agent models to go and knock on people's doors, of course, that's, the opposite is true.
Yeah, I mean, so just a lot of the stuff that I was seeing was kind of mixed in terms of, because it wasn't the health implications or the possibility for health implications because of the disease, but also because of the fact that the progress has also slowed down in terms of the uptake. But like you said, there's been also like evidence that people are more willing to try it in these times. But yeah, that's just what I was seeing. So just wanted to know if there was any other way that that it had impacted the industry. But even from like a data perspective as well, right? Have people been able to collect data in order to show investors, like you were talking about, that, even though things are a bit more all over the place, they're still able to prove that this is something that is worth investing in, even now, or more so now, rather?
It's interesting. I think those companies that are able to track what their customers are doing and spending are at an advantage to be able to tell the story of the impact of COVID on their operations. There are funds out there that are kind of designed to help small, medium enterprises in the energy access space in clean cooking, to help them if they've got any problems with working capital because of COVID. And those that are able to show legitimately the impact that COVID has had on their operations are, more likely to be successful in those applications compared to those that aren't able to tell that narrative because they don't have the data. That's certainly true.
Yeah, I think I actually hadn't even thought about that. The COVID implications of sort of being cooped up with, toxic fumes from cooking. So that's actually probably adds more urgency to the need for clean cooking. So maybe along that sense of urgency, what do you think are things that governments can do and maybe are doing to create more of an enabling environment or supporting environment for the rollout of clean cooking? And I guess as an aside to that, do you think that this is, and we've already kind of partially touched on this, but do you think this is something front of mind for governments across the world? And if it isn't, what can they do sort of to support it?
Sadly, I think it's easier to point to some policy decisions that have been made that have caused backsliding in clean cooking. You know, if I could wave a magic wand, I think, well, from the companies that we surveyed around, you know, what are the top priority policies in clean cooking? Overwhelmingly, what came back was tax exemptions. So removal of VAT for clean cooking products would be what most kind of companies would want. Sadly, in July 2020, Kenya reinstated several measures around adding VAT back onto clean cooking fuels and clean cook stoves. And what that does is it puts the formal sector at a disadvantage to the informal sector, right? You're basically making, so assuming that VAT kind of goes up, products more expensive, companies quite nascent, so passing on some, if not all, of the increased cost to their customers. That then increases the cost of the clean cooking solution, and cost is king. People don't buy clean cook stoves or fuels because of the health benefits, even in kind of these COVID times and very health conscious times. People by and large buy for two factors: convenience and for cost. So if VAT goes up and the cost of the clean cooking solution goes up, then that impacts disproportionately on the formal economy that's working in clean cooking. But the informal side, of which there's a huge amount of enterprise that goes on in the informal economy around clean cooking, like charcoal production, which kind of takes, chops down the trees in the rural areas and through pyrolysis out there, turns it into charcoal, and then a very structured supply chain that takes it through to urban areas of demand. That, ability to create charcoal isn't impacted by VAT, but it's got a huge health impact. It's got a huge environmental impact, both in terms of environmental degradation of forest cover or tree cover, but also because of the releasing of carbon into the atmosphere. But that would unimpacted by that kind of policy change. The way to make the formal sector more price competitive would be to kind of reduce or lower VAT on those clean cooking products. But then that creates other problems for governments, right? Where are we going to raise that funding from? So there's work from CCA's perspective to help understand what the cost benefit analysis is of, removing or making changes to VAT for clean cooking. Interestingly, several countries have tried banning fuels like charcoal, and is that effective or not? It's essentially, again, the informal sector responds, rises to the challenge of, okay, if you're banning it, then the price increases, and that brings new agents in to cover that demand that is still there for cooking in that way.
I was actually going to ask something like that ties in with what you said, particularly at the end. So do you think like the approach should be one to antagonize like biofuels like wood and charcoal and stuff like that against the new technologies of clean cooking, or should the approach be something that maybe like there's policy to support both of them, obviously like with the environmental and health concerns like at the forefront? So for example, like you mentioned, countries like Kenya that are like policing people's ability or restricting people's ability to go and chop wood for, fuel and stuff like that. And do you think they should take that kind of strict hardline approach, which obviously has its pros and cons, particularly things like illegal exporting and importing and like black markets and stuff like that? Or should it be more, not necessarily take such a strict approach and antagonize one, but like look for ways that can balance out the problem, given like the demographic of people that are, the target demographic?
I think we've got to do what's right by the people who are preparing the meals in the kitchen. And I don't think that rules like banning a particular fuel necessarily help that. So what is it that we can do to make cleaner fuels more desirable for those that cook with them? And that is a demand problem, but it's also a supply problem. And I think that the government side of things is more on the supply side of those fuels. So I think in terms of, the answers are going to vary border by border, basically. And I think what needs to be done is a better understanding on the cost and benefit, and just analyzing that and being able to tell that story so that governments can make their own decisions based on, energy security, based on local demand, based on local environmental cover. We think that these solutions are going to be the best, and therefore we're going to prioritize the uptake of these by making the supply of them more accessible. Notice there that it's about bringing better data to these governments so that they can make the decision. That's, I think, the only way that this can be effective. It's certainly not going to work by Clean Cooking Alliance, other actors kind of forcing or trying to lobby governments directly for one particular policy or not.
Okay. And just another question quickly. What was it that made you change from working in oil and gas for oil and gas to now be working in a more renewable space?
I didn't want to go to work sometimes when I was in the oil and gas sector. If I'm really honest, it just wasn't pulling me out of bed in the morning. I think it's attributed to Gandhi, who said, harmony arises when what you say, what you think, and what you do are in alignment. And I was an environmental biologist at university, so I always thought and felt that the environment is an important thing. Yet what I was doing was something that was actually operating in the opposite direction to that when I really looked at it. And I did a course, and I realized that I could do one of two things. I could either change what I thought about the issue and carry on doing what I was doing. That would be fine. Or I could change what I was doing and keep my thoughts and beliefs on the issue. And when I got to see that was the choice, it just seemed like a really obvious choice to change what I was doing and not relate to being kind of painted into a particular corner or doing a particular industry. So through that, then it was just made sense to change.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's quite an interesting issue in the sense that a lot of industries that maybe are associated with sort of damaging environmental impacts are now having to think about how they pivot and also how they rebrand to be able to attract, talent going forward, because there is this growing environmental and social consciousness that is becoming a bigger factor of how people decide, what jobs they want to work in and how they want to use their skills and expertise. Yeah, no, definitely interesting. And yeah, we really appreciate your time here today, Ronan. I think maybe just as we look to wrap, we have one last question that we'd like to ask every guest that we have on the podcast. And we'd like to ask you this question. So if you could get an all expense paid trip to anywhere on the African continent, where would you go? And maybe also why?
I would go back to Tanzania, to LOI. And I was there, maybe 15 years ago, and living with the Maasai. And it was an amazing experience. And I would just love to go back and gaze down into that Rift Valley again.
Wow, that's really cool. That was very cool. That's really interesting. Sorry, I'm just going to slightly probe. How long were you there for? You said you were living with the Maasai.
Wow.
For 4 months. It was one of those where you go out there to teach them English, and then you end up you're the one that gets taught by them and it was an amazing experience. But yeah, it was looking to give them a way for 21st century income through ecotourism. They were living they have these huge herds of cows. And I think one of the Maasai phrases was time is a cow. And, so when they're kind of thinking around wealth is wrapped up with how big a herd of cows you've got, that's tricky when it comes to that herd of cows kind of moving through the environment and, having to eat and kind of remove the biodiversity that's there. It was the first step to help them, kind of protect the environment that they've got around them.
Well, it's been fantastic speaking to you, Ronan, and really good to get insights on what's a very, I think, pressing and pertinent issue that probably doesn't get the right amount of visibility. So it's been really good having this conversation. We thank you for taking your time to be with us today. Thank you to my co-host, Demi,